Hello everyone, my name is Alex Sprague and I'll be continuing on with Luke's presentation with my second part. So, in the structure of the assessments that were outlined in Luke's section, the plan was to provide multiple points of reference where data could be collected and measured. As Morland, Alistair and Barlick's explaining their work in their book Design and Digital Technologies, it is essential to have diagnostic assessments for initial accounts of understanding, as well as summative assessments to compare in order to construct a learning continuum, an essential part of the curriculum requirements. And not only that, but the formative aspect is to be planned and constructed throughout both of these types of assessment in order to allow for school experiences that are much more personalized and useful. And so, therefore, by using this approach, the plan also allows for ongoing self-review for teachers, which is pivotal in moving forward with semester work and teaching approaches. And so what we did for the assessment plan was we used a diagnostic test at the start. We have the progression of the process journal, and so that will be monitored and used in class with other activities such as the self-review and the peer assessment in order to create a much more formative experience where they're actually learning whilst doing. And the summation of the journal tasks and the diagnostic test re-evaluation are part of the final assessment tasks, which will be in order to collect all the data and actually learn not only what the students have done, but how they've moved. And this is what Morland and Alistair and Barlick call the holistic assessment approach, where everything is interconnected. So the multi-purpose assessment rubric that functions as an assessment process is how Bennett describes the definition of formative assessment, where he sort of reevaluates what other people are talking about when they're wanting to describe what a formative assessment is. And so you can see here in one of the screenshots from the actual VCAR study design, this is part of outcome 3, so this is much later in the semester in the teaching period, but this is where the students will eventually do a formal folio task, and so we're leading up to that with the journal. And you can see again here in one of the references listed, we can see that folios are another form of assessment task that we can integrate to create a much more holistic approach. And so the assessment choice of a process journal derives from the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority. It's a description of the folio piece. And the reason for this is to introduce the learning skills necessary for the students, whilst also allowing for more freedom and less restriction towards the new content that they'll cover. So a folio formally will have much more restriction in terms of what's required step by step in the design process, whereas a journal is just an exploration into the skills required, specifically for illustration, as we're doing for Unit 1. And so this allows students to feel more comfortable with attempting new forms of illustration, as well as providing rapid progression for the variety of skills. And at the same time, it's less overwhelming than a traditional folio. And this is what we mean when we discuss a multi-purpose assessment plan that uses tools like a formative assessment rubric and a diagnostic measurement to provide more nuanced data for students, which are always the main focus. And as Bennett describes in his paper discussing formative assessment, in order to have this kind of learning that is student-centered, both components of the instrumentation and the process must work together in order to make learning relevant and transparent for the students. In terms of differentiation in our approach, it was evident there was so much to cover in this unit for illustration that we needed to provide opportunities for adjustments where needed. So from the assessment rubric, we attempted to construct achievement levels which were most closely resemble the achievement of key knowledge and key skills, integrating them together into standards where the students will be able to more freely choose how they approach task requirements. So this took on a criterion reference approach as defined by Brady and Kennedy in their book Curriculum Construction, where the students are not ranked explicitly and will aim for individual levels of achievement, creating a classroom culture that promotes self-betterment rather than competition, which we just agreed was a bit more constructive for the classroom environment, especially this early on. Maybe later when they're doing Year 12, it's inevitable for it to be sort of ranked, but at this stage we don't need to focus on that, and it's better for their learning development to just focus on individual achievement. For example, under the criteria of digital drawing techniques, and you can find the entire rubric that we constructed linked on Canvas with this assessment upload. This is just one part of the rubric, and so the digital technologies used in the journal are much more free than perhaps would ordinarily just be thrown in as like a general requirement. So the descriptor itself allows for the student to either illustrate work entirely using digital software, or alternatively they can choose a certain aspect of digital software to enhance or manipulate existing work. So one example, the students now have the opportunity if they desire to present previous knowledge on any variety of illustration, and can then engage more easily by integrating skills that they have already practiced in previous studies or experiences. So they can borrow over from older things that they've learned beforehand to use Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator to just demonstrate certain skills rather than constructing a whole digital image. And then beyond having specific requirements of what needs to be included, may be approached however the students like, which provide unique learning experiences to students as peers and teachers experiment to see if the approach meets the requirements outlined by VCAR. So of course we'll always go back to VCAR and the requirements outlined by the study guide. And the overall development of the rubric was modelled primarily after VCAR's guide to formative assessment rubrics, which is one of the references that designing this specific rubric involved in analysing how we approach rubrics in general. Specifically, it turned to one of the VCAR documents, which is a guide to formative assessment rubrics, and this is what this was primarily modelled after. And so when designing it, we focused on three very specific aspects to integrate into this sort of a rubric, which is describe increasing sophistication as a student's learning progresses, support consistent assessment practices, communicate to intended users, including students, other teachers, and possibly parents and carers. And so these were sort of the aspects that we wanted to focus on. And with these parameters, the rubric not only is based off of the VCAR study design, directly implementing the key learning knowledge and skills in Unit 1, but also aims to reinforce the learning continuum of the students by having this rubric as a guide to model tasks that serve multiple purposes to extend learners, measure outcomes, and evaluate methods of teaching. This way, it's again taking on that holistic approach where we're designing a rubric that the students can understand, can read, can use, and where the teachers can also use accordingly to assess how the students are progressing without being too restrictive, without being too specific, and whilst also providing students with room to experiment and to really explore and express their own development in their own ways. So this sense of differentiation allows for diverse outcomes to come from the students and does not discriminate against individuals should they find difficulty in certain tasks. In terms of grading work, the students will benefit from the way the rubric is written because it allows for multiple avenues to demonstrate outcomes. So with each of the three columns, it'll be graded in terms of 6 to 5, 4 to 3 in the middle, and 2 to 1 in the right one, with the empty column being an NA, and then the final column on the far right being the total score. And then we'll add up the scores and create an overall percentage for the assessment outcome. And this will be recorded and assessed. But we can also use it specifically to each column and create Goodman charts, for example, to really evaluate key learning outcomes as the whole class or the whole year level for that subject. So, for example, in this one that I've used for visualization drawing outcomes, we use adjectives like interesting and creative, and this is in the middle and the far left columns, to initiate a standard of design thinking, one of the key concepts that permeates all throughout visual communication and design. But there's actually no mention of the quality of the drawing itself in this section. So students who feel weaker with their drawing skills can feel less constricted knowing that they can convey their illustrations in other ways. And so this learning model would be reinforced in class tutorials where the majority of time is spent refining skills or clarifying knowledge. And this concept of choice is made even more impactful by the way that student choice is in this assessment is not simply given to them, but instead it's almost teased. And so the students will have to be creative and critical of both the systems of their own capabilities in order to solve a problem they are having, meaning they will be doing the cognitive heavy lifting. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation and Luke's presentation as well. We worked really hard together to create something that was really holistic and cohesive, and you'll find attached on Canvas our individual speech transcripts that we both uploaded. You'll find this PowerPoint presentation, our assessment plan in depth, the assessment document covering explicit instructions as an example, just for more detail, the accompanying rubric that I mentioned, which will be fully completed so you can see the whole thing, and then references to all of our speeches and all of our academic resources. Thank you very much.